You can't just drain our lake because you're having some kind of property dispute tantrum. We have 139 vacation rental cabins here now, and our guests expect access to the water. This lake serves the entire Ridgewater community, and I won't let one selfish property owner destroy what we've built here. That's what Martha Henley, president of the Ridgewater Homeowners Association, told me on a Tuesday morning in September, standing on what she apparently thought was her shoreline, gesturing toward the sprawling complex of rental cabins that had somehow materialized around my family's private lake over the past 18 months. She stood there in her crisp white polo shirt, with the HOA logo embroidered on the chest, clipboard in hand, flanked by two men in matching security uniforms, looking every inch the petty bureaucrat drunk on imaginary authority. Here's what Martha didn't know about me that morning. I'm a hydraulic engineer with 32 years of experience in dam operation and water management systems. I've designed flood control systems for 3 state agencies, consulted on hydroelectric projects across the Pacific Northwest, and spent the last decade of my career specializing in aging dam infrastructure rehabilitation. My great-grandfather built the earthen dam that created Lake Serenity in 1923, and our family has maintained the water rights and dam operation permits continuously for over a century. The lake sits entirely on our 847-acre property, fed by Willow Creek and 3 natural springs that have been flowing since the last ice age. But let me pause here for just a moment. Hey everyone, before I tell you exactly how this whole situation unfolded and how Martha's little empire came crashing down, drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from. Are you dealing with an out-of-control HOA in Florida? Battling property line disputes in Texas? Or maybe you're watching from somewhere that still respects private property rights? I love connecting with people from different places who've dealt with similar situations. And if you're enjoying this story of bureaucratic overreach getting exactly what it deserved, smash that like button. Trust me, you're going to want to see how this ends. Now, back to that September morning and my face-to-face encounter with Martha's delusions of grandeur. The cabins were impressive, I'll admit. Each structure was approximately 800 square feet of modern construction, raised on treated lumber stilts about 6 feet off the ground, with wraparound porches and large windows facing the water. Every cabin had its own private dock, extending 15 feet into the lake, complete with boat slips and underwater LED lighting systems. Someone had invested serious money here. The construction quality was professional grade, the landscaping was meticulously maintained, and each cabin had discrete bronze numbering from 1 to 139. This wasn't some thrown-together weekend project. This was a full-scale commercial development that had been planned, financed, and executed with impressive attention to detail. What made it even more surreal was how completely it had transformed the lake I'd grown up swimming in, fishing in, and maintaining for 4 decades since taking over dam operations from my father. Where there used to be natural shoreline with cattails and native water plants, there were now gravel paths connecting cabin clusters. Where great blue herons used to nest in the shallows, there were now floating party platforms with waterproof speakers. The entire eastern shore had been converted into what looked like a miniature resort community, complete with a central pavilion, communal fire pits, and a boat rental facility. "Martha," I said, keeping my voice level despite the surreal nature of the conversation, "these cabins are on my property. The lake is on my property. The dam that creates this lake is on my property, and I hold all the water rights. You never asked permission, never filed any permits with the county, and certainly never discussed this development with me or anyone in my family." She laughed. Actually laughed, a sound somewhere between amusement and condescension. "Mr. Patterson, I think you're confused about property lines. The HOA has development rights to all common areas within the Ridgewater community, and this lake clearly serves the common good of our residents and their guests. We've already consulted with our attorneys, and they've assured us that our position is legally sound. This is a classic case of unused land being put to its highest and best use for community benefit. I pulled out my phone and showed her the county assessor's map I'd downloaded that morning after receiving her voicemail demanding this meeting. The bright blue outline of our property boundaries was unmistakable on the official county website, encompassing the entire lake and extending another 200 yards beyond the furthest cabin. Our property lines were clearly marked, surveyed, and recorded, with no ambiguity about where the Ridgewater development ended and our family land began. Martha glanced at the phone screen for maybe 3 seconds and waved it away with the casual dismissal of someone who'd already decided that reality was negotiable. Anyone can fake a map on their phone these days, Mr. Patterson. Our legal team has done the due diligence on this project. We have surveys, environmental assessments, and development permits. This lake has been designated as a community amenity, and our vacation rental program is providing significant economic benefit to the entire region. That's when I knew this wasn't going to be resolved with polite conversation, property maps, or reasonable discussion. Martha had invested too much pride, too much HOA money, and too much personal credibility in her vision of Lake Ridgewater Resort to let something as inconvenient as actual property ownership derail her plans. She'd built her entire authority as HOA president around this project, and admitting it was illegal would mean admitting she'd led 139 families into a massive liability nightmare. Looking at those cabins stretching along what had been my family's peaceful lakeshore, I realized I was looking at more than just trespassing or property disputes. This was a woman who had convinced herself that wanting something badly enough, organizing it professionally enough, and investing enough money in it could somehow override a century of clear property ownership. Martha had created her own reality where private property rights were just suggestions, and HOA authority could expand to encompass anything that served the common good as she defined it. Standing there that morning, watching her gesture confidently toward cabins full of paying guests on my family's land, I knew exactly what kind of person I was dealing with. Martha wasn't going to be reasonable, wasn't going to negotiate, and wasn't going to acknowledge reality until reality forced itself upon her in terms she couldn't dismiss or explain away. That's when I started planning how to give her exactly the education in hydraulic engineering and property law that she so desperately needed. Over the next 2 weeks, Martha's approach shifted from dismissive arrogance to calculated aggression, and I got my first real taste of what happens when someone with a clipboard and an inflated sense of authority realizes their bluff has been called. The transformation was remarkable to watch, like seeing a neighborhood bully realize that their usual intimidation tactics weren't going to work and deciding to escalate instead of backing down. It started with the certified letter that arrived on a Thursday morning, sent from the law offices of Pemberton, Hayes, 2 Associates in the state capitol. The letterhead was impressive, thick cream-colored paper with raised lettering that probably cost more per page than most people spend on lunch. The content, however, was pure legal theater designed to intimidate rather than inform. The letter claimed that the Ridgewater Homeowners Association had established adverse possession rights over the lake through continuous and notorious use for recreational purposes. It demanded that I cease and desist all interference with the established recreational facility, and warned of immediate legal action to protect community assets and recover damages if I continued to threaten the stability of vacation rental enterprise. What made the letter particularly amusing from a legal standpoint was how it completely ignored the basic requirements for adverse possession claims. You can't establish adverse possession rights over property when the true owner is clearly aware of your presence and actively objecting to it. The continuous use had been going on for less than 2 years, not the minimum 5 years required under state law. And calling something a recreational facility doesn't magically transform trespassing into legitimate property rights. But Martha wasn't relying on legal merit. She was banking on the assumption that fighting a well-funded HOA legal team would be too expensive and too stressful for one individual property owner. It's a strategy that works more often than it should, simply because most people can't afford to fight legal battles over principles when the practical cost of surrender seems lower than the cost of victory. Martha had seriously miscalculated her opponent. The harassment campaign began the day after I received their legal threat. Suddenly, there were HOA security guards patrolling the public road that bordered our property, writing down license plate numbers of anyone who visited us, and taking photographs of our house, our vehicles, and our outbuildings from the roadway. They set up a folding table at the entrance to our driveway with official-looking clipboards and started approaching delivery drivers, mail carriers, and anyone else who tried to access our property. When my neighbor Jim stopped by to borrow my post-hole digger, one of the guards actually followed him up our driveway to ask what business he had on disputed property. Jim, who's lived next door for 15 years and has about as much patience for bureaucratic nonsense as I do, told the guard exactly what he could do with his clipboard and official HOA authority. The interaction was caught on our security cameras and provided some much-needed comic relief during an increasingly tense situation. But Martha's masterpiece of escalating harassment came when she discovered I had teenage grandchildren who occasionally visited during summer vacation. Suddenly, HOA security was filing noise complaints with the county every time the kids used our boat, our fishing dock, or even our own swimming area on our own lake. They claimed the children were disturbing the peace and quiet that vacation renters expect from their lakefront experience. The absurdity of the situation was stunning. Martha was filing noise complaints against children swimming on their own family's property while operating 139 vacation rental cabins full of weekend partiers who regularly held late-night gatherings with music that could be heard a mile away. But absurdity has never stopped petty tyrants from doubling down on bad decisions. That's when I decided it was time to bring in some family expertise and start fighting this battle with the same level of professional competence that Martha was using to wage it. My daughter Sarah drove up from the state capitol that following weekend. Sarah happens to be a property law attorney specializing in land use disputes, and she'd been following the situation with the kind of professional interest that lawyers get when they see someone making spectacularly bad legal decisions. She brought her surveying equipment, her laptop full of legal research databases, and her trademark methodical approach to complex property disputes. Sarah spent Saturday morning walking our property boundaries with GPS equipment and a metal detector, locating the original survey markers that had been placed when my great-grandfather first purchased the land in 1919. She photographed every marker, documented their GPS coordinates, and cross-referenced them with the original property deeds and survey maps on file with the county recorder's office. Saturday afternoon, she set up her laptop at our kitchen table and dove deep into county records, HOA filings, and state regulatory databases. Sarah has this systematic way of approaching legal research that's fascinating to watch. She starts with the fundamental documents and works outward, building layers of evidence like an archaeologist reconstructing ancient civilizations from pottery shards and foundation stones. "Dad," she told me over dinner that evening, "this situation is worse than you initially thought, but also much, much better. They've built those 139 cabins without any permits whatsoever. No building permits, no septic system permits, no environmental impact studies for construction near a water source, no zoning variance applications, nothing. The HOA never filed any development plans with the County Planning Commission. Legally, those cabins shouldn't exist. But they do exist," I pointed out, "and they're full of paying customers who think they're renting legitimate vacation accommodations." "Right. Which makes this a slam-dunk property violation case from our perspective, but also potentially an environmental disaster and a massive liability nightmare for everyone involved. Have you noticed any changes in the lake's water quality since construction started?" Actually, I had noticed changes, though I'd initially attributed them to natural variations in seasonal weather patterns. The lake's clarity had decreased noticeably over the past year, developing a slight cloudiness that hadn't been there historically. We'd also had 2 significant fish kills in the past 6 months, with dozens of bass and bluegill floating dead near the shoreline after heavy rainstorms. Sarah arranged for professional water quality testing that week, through an environmental laboratory that specialized in freshwater contamination analysis. The results came back 10 days later and confirmed our worst suspicions. Elevated nitrogen and phosphorus levels suggested septic system runoff entering the lake water. Heavy metals, including copper and zinc, indicated that construction debris had been dumped directly into the lake during the cabin building process. Bacterial counts were approaching levels that would trigger public health warnings if this were a public swimming area. Meanwhile, Martha had decided that her opening legal salvo hadn't been intimidating enough. The HOA filed formal complaints with the county claiming that I was threatening to damage community infrastructure and denying reasonable access to public waterways. They organized a petition among Ridgewater residents demanding that the county force me to share the lake resources equitably with the broader community. The petition was actually a stroke of tactical genius from our perspective, though Martha clearly didn't realize it at the time. When county officials came out to investigate the complaints, they immediately noticed the unpermitted structures and began asking questions about environmental compliance, septic systems, and construction permits. The investigation that was supposed to pressure me into cooperation instead resulted in stop work orders being issued for any ongoing construction around the lake. More importantly, county officials confirmed exactly what Sarah had already discovered through her research. Every single one of those 139 cabins was illegally constructed on private property without proper permits. Environmental review or legal authority. Martha's petition had backfired spectacularly, but instead of reassessing her strategy, she decided to escalate even further. That's when things got really interesting. Martha's next move was pure desperation disguised as righteous authority, and it revealed just how far she was willing to go to protect what she'd convinced herself was a legitimate business enterprise. Rather than acknowledging the county's findings about unpermitted construction, she filed for an emergency injunction in county court, claiming that my threats to manipulate water levels posed an imminent danger to life and property. The filing was a masterpiece of creative legal fiction. It claimed that 139 cabins full of vacation renters depended on stable water levels for safe access and emergency evacuation. It argued that I was holding the community hostage with threats to operate my own dam according to my own whims rather than community needs. Most creatively, it suggested that my advanced technical knowledge of hydraulic systems made me uniquely dangerous because I could weaponize water flow against innocent families just trying to enjoy their vacations. Sarah read the entire filing aloud to me over the phone, and I could hear her trying not to laugh at the more ridiculous passages. "Dad, they're literally arguing that your expertise in dam operation makes you a public menace. They want the court to prevent you from operating your own legally permitted dam because you know too much about how dams work." But while Martha's legal strategy was absurd, her political strategy was more sophisticated than I'd given her credit for. She'd spent those 2 weeks building a coalition of local business owners who were profiting from the vacation rental traffic. Restaurant owners, gas stations, grocery stores, boat rental companies, and equipment suppliers had all seen increased revenue from the steady stream of weekend tourists visiting Lake Ridgewater Resort. Martha organized them into what she called the Ridgewater Economic Development Coalition, complete with a Facebook page, printed flyers, and talking points about how my selfish property disputes were threatening jobs and economic growth for the entire region. She scheduled the coalition's first public meeting for the same evening as the emergency hearing, clearly hoping to pressure the judge with community sentiment. This is where my professional background became invaluable in ways that Martha clearly hadn't anticipated. While she was organizing her political theater, I was conducting the kind of systematic technical investigation that 32 years of engineering experience had taught me to do when facing complex infrastructure problems. I started with the original dam construction records from 1923, which my family had meticulously maintained, along with all subsequent inspection reports, maintenance logs, and permit renewals. Then, I pulled the historical water flow data for Willow Creek, going back to 1915, which helped establish the baseline environmental conditions before dam construction. Most importantly, I requested the complete hydrological survey data that the county had on file for our watershed, including downstream flow measurements and seasonal variation patterns. What I discovered was fascinating and would prove crucial to everything that followed. The natural water level of our area before my great-grandfather built his dam was essentially a creek with seasonal wetlands that expanded and contracted based on rainfall and snowmelt. The dam had created an artificial lake by capturing and holding water that would naturally flow downstream to 3 family farms and eventually into the state forest preserve. Those downstream property owners had adapted to the reduced water flow over the past century, but they'd never been entirely happy about it. The dam reduced their irrigation water during dry summers and eliminated the natural flood cycles that had historically recharged their groundwater supplies. I'd never thought much about this because the situation had been stable for decades, but Martha's vacation rental development was now consuming huge amounts of water for landscaping, swimming, boating, and the increased sewage treatment load from 139 additional housing units. I reached out to the 3 downstream farm families to discuss the situation and discovered they'd been dealing with steadily decreasing water availability for the past 2 years. They'd attributed it to climate change and drought conditions, but the timing coincided perfectly with the cabin construction and occupancy. More importantly, I learned that all 3 families had been contacted by environmental groups concerned about watershed protection in the state forest preserve. The reduced creek flow was affecting wildlife habitat and native plant communities that depended on consistent water levels. The Nature Conservancy had actually been considering legal action to restore natural flow patterns, but hadn't identified the dam as the source of the problem. Suddenly, I realized that Martha had inadvertently created a coalition of her own enemies. Downstream farmers, environmental groups, state forest managers, and county officials responsible for water quality were all dealing with problems directly caused by her illegal development project. But I also discovered something else during my research that week, something that would prove to be the final piece of evidence I needed to understand the full scope of Martha's operation. The vacation rental business wasn't just about cabin rentals. The HOA was also operating boat rentals, fishing guide services, catering for private events, and even helicopter landing services for wealthy guests who wanted to avoid the 2-hour drive from the regional airport. None of these commercial activities had proper permits or licensing. The boat rental operation was running without Coast Guard certification or commercial marine insurance. The catering service was operating without health department permits or commercial kitchen facilities. The helicopter landing area had been carved out of protected wetlands without environmental review or FAA approval. Martha hadn't just built 139 illegal cabins on my property. She'd created an entire illegal resort operation that was violating federal, state, and local regulations across multiple agencies and jurisdictions. The emergency hearing was held on a Thursday morning in county court, with standing room only crowds including Martha's business coalition, several downstream property owners, 2 representatives from environmental groups, and a reporter from the local newspaper who'd gotten wind of the unusual property dispute. Martha's attorney presented emotional arguments about families on vacation, economic impact to local businesses, and the supposedly devastating consequences of allowing one property owner to control water resources that serve the broader community. They had professional charts showing projected revenue from the vacation rentals, testimonials from guests about their wonderful experiences at Lake Ridgewater Resort, and letters from local business owners supporting continued operation of the facility. Then it was our turn, and Sarah had prepared a presentation that was less about emotion and more about facts, documentation, and law. She presented the original property deeds showing continuous ownership since 1919. She presented the dam construction permits, the water rights documentation, and the maintenance records proving our family's legal authority over the entire water system. She presented the county's own findings about unpermitted construction and environmental violations. But then I took the stand to present the technical evidence, and that's when Martha's confident expression started to change. I explained the dam's operation, the natural watershed patterns, and the downstream impacts of both the original dam construction and the recent dramatic increase in water consumption. I presented the water quality test results showing contamination from illegal septic systems. I documented the federal violations, including unpermitted helicopter operations and wetlands destruction. Most importantly, I explained that normal seasonal water level management wasn't just my legal right, but my legal responsibility under state dam safety regulations. Winter drawdown to prevent ice damage wasn't a threat I was making, it was standard procedure that I'd been following for decades. The judge listened to both sides, reviewed the extensive documentation, and made a decision that surprised everyone except Sarah and me. Not only did he deny Martha's emergency injunction, but he issued an immediate order requiring the HOA to cease all commercial operations of the vacation rental facility pending resolution of the multiple permit violations and property disputes. Martha stood up in court and declared, "Your Honor, you can't just shut down our entire business model because of some technical paperwork issues." The judge replied, "Ma'am, building 139 commercial structures on someone else's property without permission, permits, or environmental review is not a technical paperwork issue. It's one of the most egregious cases of unauthorized development I've seen in 20 years on this bench." That should have been the end of Martha's Lake Ridgewater Resort dream. But Martha had invested too much pride, too much HOA money, and too much personal credibility to accept defeat gracefully. Instead of beginning negotiations for removing the cabins and restoring the property, she decided to escalate one final time. That's when things got personal. And that's when Martha made the mistake that would ultimately destroy everything she'd built. The harassment campaign that followed the court order was unlike anything I'd experienced in 4 decades of living on rural property. Martha had lost her legal battle, lost her injunction, and been ordered to shut down her illegal resort operation, but instead of cutting her losses, she transformed the Ridgewater HOA into what can only be described as a domestic terrorism organization focused on making my life unbearable until I surrendered. It started with the vehicles. HOA security guards began following our cars every time we left the property. Not just noting when we came and went, but actually tailing us to the grocery store, the hardware store, medical appointments, everywhere. When my wife drove to her book club meeting, 2 guards in an HOA-branded SUV followed her there and sat in the parking lot until she came out. When I went to town for supplies, they'd park outside whatever store I entered and photograph me loading purchases into my truck. The psychological pressure was constant and calculated. They filed noise complaints every time I started a tractor, chainsaw, or any piece of equipment on our own property. Martha claimed that maintenance activities were disrupting the peace and quiet that former vacation renters had come to expect from the area. She organized daily protests outside our house, with rotating groups of Ridgewater residents carrying signs reading, "Share the lake," "Stop the water monopoly," and "Save our community investment." But Martha's masterstroke of harassment came when she discovered that our property access road crossed a small corner of HOA-controlled land near the public highway. It was a 15-foot strip that had never been an issue in decades of shared use, but Martha decided to make it one. The HOA installed a locked gate across our access road and demanded we pay commercial access fees because our property supposedly benefited from their community infrastructure. Sarah filed for another emergency court order, which we eventually won, but it took 3 weeks, during which we had to hike half a mile through forest to reach our house, carrying groceries and supplies on foot because Martha had effectively trapped us on our own property. The sheriff's department called it a civil matter and refused to intervene, even though blocking someone's legal access road is essentially false imprisonment. That's when I realized Martha wasn't just fighting over property rights anymore. She was waging personal warfare designed to force us to abandon our family land entirely. The vacation rental business was just the excuse. Her real goal was to drive us away so the HOA could claim adverse possession over the entire property, including the house my great-grandfather built and the lake he'd created. The final transgression came on a Tuesday morning in October, and it crossed the line from harassment into actual criminal sabotage. I was conducting my routine monthly maintenance inspection of the dam spillway when I discovered that someone had tampered with the control mechanisms. This wasn't casual vandalism or accidental damage. This was deliberate, sophisticated sabotage designed to prevent me from adjusting water levels according to seasonal requirements and state dam safety protocols. The manual override system had been systematically disabled. Someone had removed crucial components from the gear assemblies that controlled the spillway gates, making it impossible to raise or lower water levels using the backup mechanical controls. More seriously, they damaged the electrical control systems that managed automatic responses to heavy rainfall and emergency overflow situations. Whoever did this knew enough about dam operations to target the most critical components while making the sabotage look like equipment failure rather than deliberate destruction. But they'd made one crucial mistake. They'd left tool marks on the bolts they'd removed, and the missing parts were too specific and valuable to have been stolen by casual vandals. This wasn't just property dispute anymore. This was dam sabotage, which falls under federal jurisdiction as potential domestic terrorism. A compromised dam control system during autumn storm season could cause flooding that would endanger lives and property for miles downstream. Martha's people had escalated from trespassing and harassment to creating genuine public safety hazards. I documented everything with detailed photographs, measurements of the missing components, and analysis of the tool marks left by whoever had done the work. Then I made 3 phone calls. First to the county sheriff, then to the state dam safety office, and finally to my nephew, Marcus, who happens to work for the FBI's domestic terrorism unit in the regional field office. The investigation moved much faster than Martha had probably expected. Security camera footage from a neighboring property showed 3 individuals in HOA security uniforms accessing the dam structure at 2 a.m. on the previous Sunday morning. When federal agents confronted the guards with the video evidence, one of them immediately admitted that Martha had personally instructed them to make sure the old man can't mess with our water levels before winter. Martha had just committed a federal felony, but that created an immediate practical problem for me. The sabotaged control equipment couldn't be repaired quickly enough to handle the seasonal water level management that was required by both state regulations and basic dam safety principles. October weather patterns in our region bring heavy rains and potential flooding, followed by hard freezes that can damage spillway structures if water levels aren't properly managed beforehand. With the control systems disabled, I had limited options for protecting the dam infrastructure through the winter months. I could wait for replacement parts and professional repair services, which would take weeks and leave the dam vulnerable to weather damage. I could try to jury-rig temporary controls, which would violate state safety regulations and potentially void our insurance coverage. Or I could use the one control mechanism that Martha's saboteurs hadn't been able to disable, the main drain gates that could completely empty the lake and return Willow Creek to its original natural flow. The decision wasn't difficult from an engineering standpoint. Protecting the dam structure had to be the priority, both for legal compliance and public safety. But I knew exactly what emptying the lake would mean for Martha's 139 illegal vacation rental cabins. I called everyone I could think of who might be affected by a complete lake drawdown. The County Emergency Management Office, all downstream property owners, the State Environmental Department, the Nature Conservancy representative who'd been monitoring watershed issues, and yes, I even called Martha directly to warn her that the lake was going to drop to its natural creek level over the next 48 hours. Martha's response was predictably volcanic. "You can't do this. You'll destroy our entire investment. I'll sue you for everything you own." This is exactly the kind of vindictive manipulation we were trying to prevent. Martha, I said, keeping my voice level, your people sabotaged my dam controls. I have to protect the dam structure before winter weather arrives, and this is now the only way I can do it safely. The lake will return to its natural level, which is exactly where it was for thousands of years before my great-grandfather built his dam. But the cabins, the docks, the whole resort infrastructure. The cabins were built illegally on my property, without permits or permission. The docks extend into a lake that exists entirely at my family's discretion. The resort infrastructure was never legal to begin with. That was always your problem to solve, Martha. I opened the main drain gates at 6 a.m. on Wednesday morning. By Thursday evening, Lake Serenity had returned to Willow Creek, a meandering stream about 4 feet wide and 2 feet deep, flowing through what had been the lake bottom for the past century. 139 vacation rental cabins now sat on stilts above a muddy creek bed, their private docks extending into empty air like diving boards over a desert. The immediate aftermath was beautiful chaos. Vacation renters who'd booked their luxury lakefront experience arrived throughout the day to find their cabins overlooking a babbling creek. The HOA's carefully curated social media presence exploded with photos of confused tourists standing on docks above empty mud, boat ramps leading to nowhere, and waterfront cabins that were now creek-adjacent at best. Martha's Lake Ridgewater Resort went from 4- and 5-star online reviews to pages of 1-star ratings with photos that spoke louder than any legal arguments ever could. Guest after guest demanded full refunds and threatened lawsuits for false advertising. Several families who'd driven hundreds of miles for their lake vacation simply turned around and went home. But the real reckoning was just beginning. Martha called an emergency HOA meeting for Friday evening, held at the community center with overflow crowds spilling into the parking lot and a line of cars stretching back to the main highway. The agenda was supposed to focus on emergency measures to restore lake levels and protect community assets, but it turned into something Martha clearly hadn't anticipated. A complete reckoning with 18 months of lies, illegal activities, and financial mismanagement. The meeting started exactly as Martha had planned, with her standing at the podium in her crisp HOA president blazer, presenting PowerPoint slides about temporary water level fluctuations and negotiations with neighboring property owners to restore lake access. She talked about emergency pumping systems, temporary water sources, and legal strategies to force me to refill the lake. For the first 10 minutes, it almost sounded like she had everything under control. Then the questions started. 3 things happened at that meeting that Martha clearly hadn't prepared for, and each one systematically destroyed another pillar of the authority she'd built her entire HOA presidency around. First, several HOA residents, who were also attorneys, had spent the week since the court order researching the legal situation for themselves. They'd discovered what Sarah had found months earlier. The entire vacation rental project violated the HOA's original covenants, had been approved without the proper member votes required for major expenditures, and potentially exposed every single HOA member to personal liability in the inevitable lawsuits from defrauded vacation rental guests. Margaret Chen, a retired corporate lawyer who lived in Phase 3 of the development, stood up with a thick folder of documents and asked the question that changed everything. Martha, can you please explain to the membership exactly what legal authority you used to spend $2.3 million in HOA funds on a commercial development project without a membership vote? And why none of us were informed that this project was built entirely on property the HOA doesn't own? The room went dead silent. You could actually hear people shifting in their seats as the implications sank in. Martha stammered something about executive authority and community benefit, but Margaret wasn't finished. I've spent this week reviewing our HOA's original covenants, our bylaws, and every board meeting minute for the past 2 years. There is no record of any vote authorizing this expenditure. There is no documentation of any legal review of property boundaries. There is no environmental impact assessment, no permit applications, and no insurance coverage for commercial operations. We're looking at potential personal liability for every homeowner in this association. The second revelation came from downstream property owners who attended in force to thank me publicly for returning Willow Creek to its natural flow patterns. Jake Morrison, whose family had been farming the valley below our dam since the 1940s, brought photographs showing the difference between creek levels before and after the lake drawdown. For the past 2 years, we've been dealing with steadily decreasing water flow that was hurting our crops and our livestock operations, Jake told the packed meeting. We thought it was drought, but now we understand it was this resort project consuming massive amounts of water that naturally belonged to the entire watershed. Mr. Sedes Patterson returning the creek to its historical flow has restored water access that our families depended on for generations. Jake was joined by representatives from 2 other farm families and, most impressively, by Dr. Jennifer Walsh from the State University Extension Service, who presented data showing how the restored creek flow was already improving native trout habitat and recharging groundwater supplies that had been depleted during the artificial lake period. The natural creek ecosystem supports significantly more biodiversity than the artificial lake ever did, Dr. Entens. Walsh explained. What Mr. Patterson has done isn't environmental destruction, it's environmental restoration, on a scale that will benefit wildlife and agricultural communities for decades to come. The third bombshell came from Tom Bradley, the State Environmental Department representative who'd been investigating water quality issues around the former lake. His findings were devastating for Martha's remaining credibility and potentially criminal for several HOA board members. Our investigation has determined that the 139 vacation rental cabins were dumping untreated sewage directly into the lake through illegal septic connections, Bradley announced to the stunned crowd. The bacterial contamination levels we measured would have created a serious public health crisis within another few months. We're talking about potential hepatitis, E. coli, and parasitic infections for anyone who swam in or consumed that water. Bradley continued with technical details that made several people in the audience visibly nauseous. The illegal septic systems hadn't just been cutting corners. They'd been creating a toxic waste dump in what families had been using as their primary recreational water source. Children had been swimming in water contaminated with raw sewage. People had been fishing and cooking their catch from a lake that was essentially an open sewer by the time I drained it. Martha tried to maintain control of the meeting, but resident after resident stood up to demand answers. How had this project been approved without their knowledge? Why hadn't environmental permits been obtained? Who was liable for the contaminated lake cleanup? How much HOA money had been spent on legal fees, fighting a battle they were destined to lose? What about insurance coverage for the lawsuits that were already being filed by defrauded vacation rental guests? The meeting that was supposed to rally support for Martha's leadership instead became a forum for her complete political destruction. By 9 p.m., a motion had been made, seconded, and passed by overwhelming majority to remove Martha and the entire HOA board from office immediately. By 9:30, a new emergency board had been elected with a single mandate: negotiate a settlement with my family and begin removing the illegal cabins as quickly as possible. The FBI investigation concluded 2 weeks later with federal charges against Martha and 2 security guards for conspiracy to commit dam sabotage. Martha pled guilty to avoid prison time but received 3 years of federal probation, restitution orders for all dam repair costs, and a lifetime ban from serving on any HOA board in the state. Her co-conspirators received shorter sentences but lost their private security licenses permanently. The new HOA board, led by Margaret Chen as emergency president, negotiated a settlement that exceeded even Sarah's optimistic projections. The agreement included complete removal of all 139 cabins within 6 months, restoration of the entire property to its natural condition at HOA expense, payment for comprehensive environmental cleanup and monitoring, and establishment of a permanent conservation easement protecting the entire watershed from future development. The cabins themselves were donated to Habitat for Humanity, which relocated them to appropriate sites where they now provide affordable housing for working families across 3 counties. The professional-grade docks and infrastructure were sold to legitimate marina operators, with the proceeds funding the environmental restoration work. But here's my favorite part of this entire story, and the element that transformed a simple property dispute into lasting positive change for our entire region. 6 months after the lake drawdown, the county approached us about a partnership to create a proper public recreation area on the other side of our property, where Willow Creek enters from the state forest land. Working with environmental groups and the State Parks Department, we designed a small day-use area with canoe and kayak access, fishing platforms designed for accessibility, and educational signs about watershed protection and native wildlife habitat. The Willow Creek Recreation Area opened 18 months later and has become a popular destination for families, school groups, and nature education programs. Unlike Martha's artificial resort, it's designed to work with the natural ecosystem rather than dominating it. The restored creek supports native trout populations that hadn't been seen in the area for decades. Birdwatchers have documented over 40 species that returned after the lake was drained. The natural seasonal flooding cycles have restored wetland areas that now serve as crucial habitat during migration seasons. The creek flows freely now, according to natural patterns that existed for thousands of years before human intervention. During spring snowmelt, it becomes a rushing torrent that reminds you of the power that carved these valleys. During summer dry periods, it maintains deep pools that provide cool refuge for wildlife. In autumn, it runs clear and steady, perfect for the brown trout that migrate up from the larger river systems. Our family still enjoys Lake Serenity whenever we choose to raise the water levels for our own use, but we've learned to appreciate the creek's natural rhythms in ways we never did when the lake was permanent. There's something deeply satisfying about working with natural systems rather than trying to control them completely. Martha learned that expertise beats arrogance, documentation defeats bluster, and you can't build a sustainable business model on stolen land and environmental destruction. The Ridgewater community learned that HOA boards need rigorous oversight and that environmental regulations exist for compelling reasons. The broader region learned that sometimes the best response to illegal development is simply to stop enabling the artificial conditions that made it possible. And I learned something too. Sometimes the most powerful response to someone else's overreach isn't legal warfare or political maneuvering. Sometimes it's simply returning to the natural order of things and letting reality teach the lessons that human stubbornness refuses to learn. Every time I walk down to check the spillway now, I think about how Martha's entire empire depended on something that was never hers to control. She built 139 cabins on the assumption that the lake would always be there, that water rights were just suggestions, and that wanting something badly enough could override a century of clear property ownership. The creek runs free now, supporting life in ways that Martha's artificial resort never could. And that feels exactly like justice should feel, not vindictive or cruel, but natural and inevitable, like water finding its proper course after a temporary obstruction is finally removed.